Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to In the City. Each week we unpack a story that's crucial to the world's financial capitals. I'm Lacqua Stratton.
And I'm David Merritt.
So Dave, a big story in the deal and defence space broke this week. Italian aerospace and defence company Leonardo replaced American Bank of America, with German lender Deutsche Bank.
Yes, and this story really struck me, along with a few others that we've seen this week. For example, we heard out of Italy that the government there is rethinking a potential deal with Elon Musk's Starlink and instead considering a European alternative such as France's Eutelsat. And these start to add up to a picture, don't they, Allegra, of European companies having another think about the custom that they're sending over the Atlantic.
Yeah, the unintended consequences of Trump decisions. So both stories are examples of a changing world order. So in this week's episode, we're exploring this question. As Trump pares back on the US security commitments to Europe, could we see more European businesses pare back their use of American companies in response?
Welcome to the City of London.
The City of London.
The next station is Bank. Please mind the gap between the train and the platform.
The financial heart of the country.
The City.
The City.
Welcome to In the City.
Stand clear of the doors, please.
And with us in the London studio is Dinesh Nair. Dinesh is the chief deals correspondent for Bloomberg and, of course, had a byline on that Leonardo story that we were talking about. Welcome to In the City, Dinesh.
Thank you for having me.
This particular deal, I think what seems like a bit of a first, I can't remember another example of this, or maybe I'm wrong. A European company is a client of one of the giant American investment banks. And after witnessing the events in Washington and the language coming out of Washington and the European response the last couple of weeks, appears to have made a decision to ditch that relationship in favour of one of the old European giants, in this case, Deutsche Bank. Is that a new thing?
Yeah, it kind of is. I have seen several examples over the last few years of my deal reporting of European banks getting replaced by American banks.
That's what's supposed to happen, right? Like the American banks are hoovering up the business.
Exactly. So this is a pretty big change, even though it is, it's just a mandate. But again, like what it says is that there is an increasing feeling among European companies, given what is happening with the Trump rhetoric from the US, that they need to have some, not to say complete independence from American banks, but a little bit more dependency on European lenders. And this is probably the first concrete example we've seen of that. But anecdotally, when we speak to a lot of European companies and their deal makers, we do hear this coming up quite often now.
You've written in the piece, and I've got it in front of me, you say you've spoken to people off the record, they don't want to be identified because of client confidentiality, but several European bankers are saying they've noticed growing interest from local companies seeking to do deals and to raise funds. So all of that lucrative business, which again, it's like the likes of Bank of America, JP Morgan in the last years, we all thought they were unassailable in terms of offering the scale and these services. And yet this is a big pivot. Has this happened literally in the last week or so since we saw the blow up with Zelensky in the Oval Office with Trump, the J.D. Vance speech at Munich, which everyone says really was them telling Europe very loud and clear that the transatlantic relationship is not going to continue as it was before. Everyone saw that. Is this now the reaction?
Yeah, I would say yes. I think the recent events in the past 3 or 4 weeks has really kind of exasperated the logic behind this. But this is not a new talking point. Over the last few years, the dominance of American banks in Europe has been a talking point. The problem we've always had in Europe is that European banks were getting weaker and weaker, whereas American banks were getting stronger, actually. So Deutsche Bank had its moment, Credit Suisse had its moment a few years back. But now they've come to a point where some of these banks are, I wouldn't say at their peak, but they're much better than how they were performing 2 to 3 years back.
Before we look at the impact for Europe, can we just try and paint the scene in America, perhaps in the Bank of America board room, whenever they process this? Do you think that they'll just be shrugging, or do you think they'll be getting on the phone to the White House and saying, guys, this is becoming a problem for us?
Time for some more European tariffs, right?
Yeah, I think they're mostly shrugging it off at the moment. If you look at the US banks also, there is a bit of a worry that, this expected deal boom we're hoping to see this year hasn't actually resonated. And in fact, fact, it looks like it's going to be a difficult year for M&A. When you get into a difficult year, you want to win every piece of business. So this is not helping their cause, but I think they would be more worried if they see more examples of big European corporations like thinking about their core banking relationships and saying, listen, we have 3 American banks. We don't need that anymore. We'll replace one of them with a European bank.
So is there evidence that others will be looking at Leonardo's decision and thinking, right, they've done it, we'll do it?
Anecdotally, yes. These things always happen behind the scenes. So we've not caught everything probably which is out there, but we do hear more and more that this is happening.
It's so fascinating. And I think so what you're describing is a bit of a double whammy for the American banks. You've got European customers who are giving them the cold shoulder. But you've also got all this nervousness, and I know we've seen this in the markets, haven't we, in the last few weeks. Everyone's starting to talk about the Trump bump turning into a potential Trump slump, and everyone's sitting on their hands because there's so much uncertainty. Do you like that? so much. I didn't actually coin that one. So much uncertainty because of all this tariffs. They're on, they're off, they're on, they're off. No one knows what's going to go on, and so companies are obviously holding back on M&A. So you're seeing a pullback on that activity. And also these customers, suddenly the brand of American banks and America in general becomes a little bit toxic in Europe, and they're going to get doubly hit. Just a few months ago, we were talking about how buoyant everything was. Has everything changed in the last few weeks?
It is changing massively. Actually, it's changed in the last 3-4 weeks quite dramatically. I think we went into January with the hope, and there were some big deals to show for that. We had a big energy deal in the US. We had a big healthcare deal in the US to begin the year with, and it was a very strong January. February was one of the worst months in the last 10 years or so for M&A. So the shift is so rapid. Now, the thing here is we also have to understand that there's a lot of volatility in the rhetoric which comes out from the US. So if they change the tone, it could make a big difference, but at the moment there's a lot of nervousness and there's a lot of companies pulling back, or we're hearing increasingly number of deals which are in the works have been paused or like completely stalled actually, so it's just not a good sign.
And of course there's a particular defence angle to this. Obviously Leonardo is a defence company, but more broadly, and again, you're just wondering the extent to which the defence sector is going to start to be on the phone to the Trump administration as well as the banking sector, in that if you're a big US prime, and you're hearing Europe going to pour huge amounts of money into defence companies, but necessarily they're going to have to be European defence companies. And obviously there's some kit that only the Americans supply, but over the years, the Europeans are now saying we've got to pivot and we've got to make this stuff ourselves.
Leonardo estimates a revenue increase of as much as 3 billion euros for each extra percentage point of GDP Italy, just Italy alone, spends to ramp up its defence sector. In Germany, we saw, and we had an event here in Bloomberg last night for our subscribers talking about Trump in Europe, and John Authers, one of our great economists, used the word epochal for the shift in Germany. He was in Frankfurt last week. 900 billion euros of extra spending, nearly $1 trillion pouring into defence. And to Allegra's point, these are going to go into European companies now, aren't they?
Yeah. I mean, what we're seeing is unprecedented. Like the decoupling of Europe from the US is kind of happening. Someone was mentioning to me is Trump, not sure if he's making America great again, but he's definitely trying to make Europe great again. And this is a huge moment.
He did, he said even in the first term that he wanted us to start to take our own defence needs seriously. Yeah. But of course, the sort of extent of it and the extent of the kind of the great big sucking sound of people saying, right, we're going to do this in Europe for Europeans, there will be financial consequences for him.
It will have massive financial consequences for the American defense companies if they manage to do that in Europe. Now, the big brother is not just taking the support away, but the big brother is also getting close to the bully, actually. So, which is a very tricky situation to be in, and it can have ripple effects on other industries. Europe should have done all these things, but they needed a trigger point to kind of get them going. And I think what happened in the last few weeks is the trigger for that. I was having a conversation with a senior German banker in Davos, and he was saying that what people don't understand about Germany, yes, corporate Germany is kind of broken, as the new chancellor rightly said so. But what people don't understand is that Germany had the bandwidth to really inject a very serious amount of capital, given how their fiscal deficit is so low. But they had their own impediment of the debt brake, which they've now released, actually. It's a huge moment in Germany. I don't think people kind of understand the impact
described
of
last night as, John Authers said again, he said it was as big as the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Probably for me, like economically, it's even bigger. I don't think people understood the magnitude of what is coming out actually of Germany. And I think Europe needs that kind of leadership from a big economy like Germany. But it's also impressive what's happening in other parts of Europe as well. I think this feeling of that they need to stand together now because the support, what has been promised for over the years, is probably not going to be there.
Can I ask about Elon Musk as well? Because the others I mentioned about it, Italy getting cold feet about using Starlink. I was looking the other day at the Tesla earnings and the numbers out of Germany. I think Tesla orders are down like 75% or something in Germany. His own personal fortune, Musk, he's lost 100 billion of that wealth in the last few weeks. Tesla share price is down a lot. And it's because the sales are cratering in other bits of the world. And in Germany particularly, he came out in support of the far-right AfD in the election. So do you think that could be one of the biggest casualties, the collection of Musk companies, most prominently, I suppose, Tesla, across Europe?
I haven't heard of a lot of instances where not using American goods is taking prevalence. I mean, except maybe in Canada.
I mean, it's big in Canada, isn't it?
Yeah, it's big in Canada.
The
Canadians are good at that sort of thing.
I think the worrying thing when I think about US and American politics today is if Trump sits back and asks himself, who's his friend today in the world? Who is it actually, right? He's kind of alienated his closest allies, whether it is Canada, Europe. China's never been a friend. Maybe it is Russia now, actually. Who is it, actually? And I think this is the big problem they have. Like, when it comes to the companies, American economy has sustained over the years because of its ability to sell products to the world. And if people start saying that, listen, we are going to go local and not buy some of these goods, like Tesla is a classic example, but I don't think we've seen that yet, but I think there will be a big impact on the company. So I also feel like they will get logical at some point that this rhetoric cannot continue.
When the metrics start to come into the Trump White House of either inflation in the US or a kind of depression in the number of American goods bought or whatever, when those numbers come in, do they respond to numbers or do they continue with the path that they seem to be on at the moment, which is, like the hockey stick, we've got to go down to go up and trust us eventually.
He seemed to say that this week, didn't he?
He said
we're going through transition.
Yeah, and we've all heard that before.
The market interpreted as recession.
I think the question is this a White House that blinks? And they are showing all the signs of not believing in blinking, of saying, you guys don't get it. We are unique. This is leadership. This is going to hurt. And we're going to carry on. And eventually it's going to come good. Or whether there's too many inputs that start to come to them, be it Musk starts to find his boards on all his numerous companies or his family members, often
or
it's
is
his
it
brother
Jamie
that
Dimon, because they lose so much European business.
Bank of America, all
and
on
he
the
gets
phone.
on the phone to the White House. And who would Trump listen to? Would the bankers be the ones that actually, or Wall Street gets on his case?
I mean, he has, I think, 14 billionaires on cabinet or whatever. So I'm sure they're kind of giving advice whenever you lose money. The one statement from Trump I couldn't believe at all is that when he said he's not looking at the stock market, and
history,
history,
I think we know that's not true.
Yeah, I think history tells us that can't
when you
be
have
true.
Scott Bessent at Treasury, you have Howard Lutnick as the Commerce Secretary. These are Wall Street names.
These are big Wall Street names and they mean business. And everyone thought Trump means business. Like everyone thought Trump was going to ease regulation, bring inflation down. There's going to be a huge stock market boom. There's going to be less taxes.
Tax cuts,
but nothing is happening now and he's not blinking, which is true. He's still adamant at what he wants to. But I think at some point sense will prevail. And especially as you mentioned, Allegra, like in stock market, in the equity prices, a huge factor for a common man in the US, unlike maybe in Europe or elsewhere in the world.
I think for the Europeans, it will be the unpredictability. As you say, even if there was a kind of diplomatic charm offensive, which I don't think any of us can foresee or imagine, even if it were to be the case, I think it feels from the European perspective that this is a settled view. Now, and especially for Germany, now they've made this decision and they've crossed the proverbial Rubicon and so on, given all the cultural trepidation around defence spending. They've done it now. And as you say, and as John said at our event, it's been seen to be leadership and the right thing to do for Germany. They're not going to unwind that.
I just want to ask a final question about London and the City of London, because we have seen, again in the last few weeks, a kind of partnership between Britain and Europe on this question that we haven't seen since Brexit and all the years of rancour, hosting a summit in London right after that blow-up in the Oval Office. Macron and Starmer seemingly new besties. Here in the city, how are people playing this? A lot of people are employed by the big American banks here, but also we have the European headquarters still, but effectively for a lot of the big European banks. Do they just flip over to the other side? I mean, what does it mean for the bankers around the City of London?
I would use the term bankers used to us more often, cautiously optimistic still. I think, it's still not...
Can they have their cake and eat it there with America and Europe? Is it that? Are we back to the cake?
Yeah, I think a lot of the good, talented European bankers still work for American banks and unlikely to change quite soon. But I think what we're seeing is probably good for the city, like more European business. I think what happens with the GDP growth in the continent, a lot of the work will come into the city because, as you mentioned, David, you take any big European bank, the core of the investment bankers who actually produce the revenues still sit in London mostly. So it should be good for the city. I think city has other challenges it needs to get into. We need to revive our stock markets, and there's a lot of things. Get companies to list here again and not move the listing to US, which is another thing which I wonder, that whole domicile issue. Is that now going to stop or at least take a pause? Because we've seen a lot of companies move to the US. But again, if European stock valuations are going up and S&P is going down, that trade is not looking that great
European
anymore.
Investors don't want maybe as much of their portfolios put into the capital markets in America.
Exactly.
That could be a whole new dimension. It's what the London Stock Exchange have been desperate for.
And the Chancellor.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
But it's one thing to stop companies from moving, and it's another thing to get companies to come to London, actually, I think. And we are still a little bit away on that.
That is fascinating. And Dinesh, I know you will be breaking those stories as they as they come out. Dinesh, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's In the City from Bloomberg. This episode was hosted by me, Allegra Stratton, and David Merritt. It was produced by Summer Sardi and Moses Andam, with sound design by Blake Maples, and Brendan Francis Newnham is our executive producer. Special thanks to Dinesh Nair, and please subscribe, rate and review wherever you listen to podcasts.